Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. My name is Dr. Chiedo Nwankwor, and I direct the SAIS Women Lead. We're excited to have you with us today as the teams present their findings on the SAIS Women Lead Practicum project for this ending academic year. SAIS Women Lead mission is to increase and amplify women's leadership around the world to inspire balanced, sound policies. By fostering scholarship and cross-cultural exchange, SAIS Women Lead hopes to raise awareness of the gender gap in leadership, policy, research, and advocacy, and contribute to closing them through a mix of forward-thinking and inclusive curricula and co-curricular activities. The SAIS Women Lead aims to build powerful and effective women leaders who will contribute to creating a better and more stable society in their different fields. As we know, this academic year has been challenging, to say the least. Yet these teams have worked tirelessly and worked really hard to navigate the challenges presented by the pandemic. The teams, BRAC, IRI, and WIIS, have worked hard to successfully complete the tasks and deliver to the clients. Before you hear from the teams themselves, we have the pleasure of having with us today Dr. Dafna Rand, who will deliver the keynote. Dr. Rand most recently served as Vice President for Research and Policy at Mercy Corps, where she managed Mercy Corps' global policy and research work. Prior to that, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, covering the Middle East. Her career has included positions as the Deputy Director of Research at the Center for a New American Security, a member of the National Security Council staff, and the State Department's Office of Policy Planning staff, and 2 tours of duty as a Senate staffer covering national security and foreign assistance issues. Dr. Rand is the author of Roots of the Arab Spring, Contested Authority and Political Change in the Middle East. Dr. Rand left Mercy Corps last week and is preparing to return to the US government as a senior official. Glad to have you with us, Dr. Rand. Just a few housekeeping notes before Dr. Rand takes over. After each team's presentation, they will take a few questions from the audience before we move on to the next team. Please use the Q&A button down on your screen to send in your questions for the teams. If the teams are unable to take all the questions today because of time, they will reach out to you individually with a response afterwards. And also feel free to follow us on Twitter, our Facebook page, as well as our Instagram page. And so without much further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Dafna Rand. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you, particularly you, Dr. Nwankwor, and Professor Gardner, who's joined us, particularly to all of the students who have worked so hard. I've read your presentations and they're quite impressive. So thank you to all who are joining. Thank you for inviting me. It is such a pleasure to join the SAIS Women's Lead Practicum presentations. And really congratulations again on the great topics and the great research. I've skimmed them and I can already see that there were months of very thoughtful and diligent research and excellent analysis. And I really commend you for being creative in your research methods, given the practicalities of COVID and the impediments, obviously, to field research. But today, in the short time I have with you, I want to zoom out beyond the topics at hand, beyond the important questions of how to improve competitiveness of female political candidates in Sri Lanka, beyond the problem of food security among female agricultural workers in California, and beyond the program participants in Dar es Salaam who participated in the ELA program. Connecting all of these projects and looming over them and actually motivating, it seems, the SAIS Women's Lead program itself is a question that I've identified, and I would like to title this keynote the following: what is my theory of change and why? Today, I want to talk about three main points as you, as students and soon-to-be practitioners and professionals, identify your theory of change. First, I'd urge you to decide, what is the unit level of analysis that you want to change? Change happens at all kinds of levels. It happens at the micro level, at the macro level, at the meso level, at the national level, at the international level, and honestly, everywhere in between. It can happen within families, for example, and we all know examples where changing women's empowerment in the home vis-a-vis male relatives and other relatives can really enable traditional households and the women in them to seek non-traditional modes of employment, and everyone gains socioeconomically. Of course, we know examples of change at the village or town and communal level, where the key is to change practices and norms, the habits of a community. And by changing these habits, doors open for previously excluded groups, of course, including women. And sometimes change that happens at the communal level occurs because of new leadership from the top, but often it happens because of activism from the bottom. Either way, there's no one formula for this level of analysis, this formula for communal change. And then there's the level of policy change, which often is affected by both top-down and bottom-up aspirations. Here, legislative, legal, or policy shifts intend to change incentives, to change structures, and usually doing so via institutions. Think about social safety nets. Think about here in the United States. What are we seeing? A theory of change that is very dramatic. In the past 4 to 6 months, we've seen dramatic, expedited social policy changes manifested in the COVID relief bills of the past few months, including new ways to alleviate child poverty, and in fact, proposed dramatic, systematic changes to key drivers of undereducation and job insecurity, including new ideas of systemic solutions to the problem of early childhood education. But whatever level is your theory of change rests at, the next question is, who is the change agent? And that is you. I'm assuming that you all will be and are the change agents. To do so, to be a change agent, you need to develop a very thoughtful and adaptive theory of change. If you want to change a household, for example, you need to intervene at the individual level. But developing a theory of change is not simple. It requires a hypothesis, generating a hypothesis. You need to have a working assumption of how some sort of intervention or shift will improve outcomes. In order to derive a thoughtful hypothesis, you need to do research. You need to first know the conditions that might affect when and where your hypothesis will work or not. And then once you have your hypothesis, you need to drive hard against this hypothesis, but always remain open to adaptive learning. That is, always, as you see new evidence and see new information, you need to incorporate this feedback from the real world and change your hypothesis. In fact, a good hypothesis has been changed and adapted based on real world evidence many times. So if the first question is, what is the level of analysis? At what level do you want to derive and devise a theory of change? There's a second question you need to answer. Why is this the level of change that I'm after? And this is often personal to all of us. You might know of something about you and your temperament. It might be about your personality. It might be about your skills and your strengths and your weaknesses. Often, as you devise and create a theory of change, your background comes into play, what you've seen in the world, where you come from, who your parents are. And that might affect how you're suited to think and act at this level of analysis. So please don't forget wondering and questioning, why am I creating this theory of change of how I want to change environments? So the third question I'd ask you is, who are the agents? You alone are not enough. You need to be a leader, but you're not sufficient. You need partners. To create a theory of change, you want to think about who you'll need in your kitchen cabinet. Who will make the change? And to create your kitchen cabinet and to think about who are the agents, you also have to think about the forces that are holding people back from supporting you, right? Are there silent supporters of the change that you're after? That is among the most important questions in developing a theory of change. Who can support you who is silent? And how do you shift these constituents and stakeholders from silence to advocacy? Now, I've given you this very theoretical list of questions you should ask as you move on beyond SAIS and into your practical experiences professionally. I'd like to shift now and give you some examples from my own career and how I've addressed theories of change in the policy space. Starting with question 2, I've decided in the past 10 or 20 years that the policy arena is the arena that's best suited for my theories of change. That's where I feel situated. That's where I feel comfortable. I like this environment. I trust and believe in institutions for a number of reasons. So it fits me. But I can tell you, I've just spent 4 years managing and being an executive at Mercy Corps and joining 6,000 people who believe their theory of change is not at the policy level. My colleagues at Mercy Corps so boldly and courageously believe that the theory of change was at the individual, community, and often national level. So again, I've identified my own personal, for my background, policy level of analysis for my theory of change. And let me give you some examples of things that I've driven toward and tried to achieve and tried to change in the past number of years. So the year is 2011, and I'm at the State Department. I'm a relatively newly minted PhD in political science with an expertise in the Middle East. And it ends up that I had done my field research in a number of countries, including in Tunisia under the autocratic regime of Ben Ali, President Ben Ali. And I'm sitting in the State Department, and here we have before our eyes a revolution entirely bottom up, really not encouraged in any way from Western powers, European powers, the United States, but a change of regime overnight, and the ancien regime, the old forces are gone, and there's a very weak and new proto-democratic transitional leadership. And so one of the things I worked on very, very hard in the year 2011 and subsequently is how to make democracy stick, how to enable transitioning democracies like Tunisia that had relatively encouraging variables in its communities and society successfully transition to democracy. What was the theory of change needed to do that? And of course, first and foremost, it started with the people of Tunisia. And sitting at the State Department and the US government, none of us had the hubris to think that it started anywhere but the government of Tunisia and the people of Tunisia. But we believed that we could help and that we could rally the international community to help support the energy and aspirations and goals towards a democratic transition in Tunisia. And so over the following couple years, my colleagues and I tried really hard to rally the world in support of economic assistance to the fledgling transitional government in Tunisia, to support through NGO funding the technical capacity to write a new constitution, which ended up being extremely sticky and extremely provocative and extremely controversial in their society, but ultimately prevailed. And to train all kinds of people in the nuts and bolts of a democratic society, including how to run civil society organizations, how to hold police accountable, how to create ombudsman positions for local municipalities, and on and on and on. And so I have to say we tried really hard, and I'm not sure if all of our efforts in the international community were decisive or dispositive, but here we are 10 years later, and it is really one of the wonders of the Arab revolts of 2011 that the Tunisian transition has worked. And as difficult as it is, and despite all of the socioeconomic challenges and the security challenges that have been vast and significant, there has been a successful transition through 2 election cycles, and the current government stands stable. A second example is probably less happy, but I found myself again at the State Department in the year 2016, and I will go quickly now because we don't have much time, but here I see that the Obama administration had decided to support a war led by the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. And there was something in me that believed that this wasn't right. And here I was, a senior official in the Human Rights Bureau, and I just knew this wasn't right. There was something wrong about it. It just didn't seem strategically right. Why were we supporting this war? What was in it? Why were so many civilians dying? And so for the subsequent years, I really made it my mission every day at the State Department to raise the questions of why we were supporting this war, to talk to Congress, to create better oversight over the civilian casualties, to work with NGOs and advocates, halfway through this effort, I left the Obama administration and moved to Mercy Corps, and I continued my advocacy on Capitol Hill. And in fact, you know, this is one of the situations where the advocacy grew and grew and grew over the years until Congress began pushing the Trump administration and now the Biden administration to really end U.S. involvement. And there was near consensus in the national security environment and among the blob that this war would have been a strategic error. But I tell you, in 2015, 2016, when I started raising my hand and my voice and saying, I don't think things are right here, what are we doing? And asking polite but kind of slightly irritating questions of my colleagues, that was not the consensus. So in my mind, the goal of that advocacy effort was to change the consensus view about the Yemen war. I should say that although the Biden administration opened its administration in January by pulling out all vestiges of US support for the coalition, the war is not over. And it is actually quite tragic that although the US has corrected its horrible mistake of entering this war, it's in some ways too late. So this is a sort of sadder example from my own career, that one which I feel really sad about. And the final example I'll give you is the question of development and democracy in Central America, particularly in the Northern Triangle countries. And here's something that came to the fore and came to the attention of the US government and Mexican government and a lot of the Western Hemisphere in 2014, when we saw with our own eyes unaccompanied minors appearing on the border, and it was quite tragic. And the Obama administration poured $750 million into development funds to help the situation, to help address the root causes of migration, the push factors, we called them in 2014. I have been working on this ever since, both as an advocate and a policymaker, pushing to think really carefully about how we use those economic development funds to address these root causes, to really identify the very myriad and interconnected variables that affect migration decisions. So in light of time, I'll stop there. These are three examples that are very clear to my heart, that were my theories of change, things I'm still working on. They're not completed, of course. But I want you, as you go out into the world and kind of leave SAIS and take from this practicum the observation that you will need to decide your theory of change, what suits you, and encourage you to kind of ask these three questions I've laid out, and most importantly, to look around for the partners and stakeholders that can help you. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Rand, for that thoughtful and thought-provoking address. And so because we're running behind time, I will just go ahead and hand over to the first team that will be presenting, Team IRI. You're on board.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's presentation, Women Who Lead, a framework to enhance women's political competitiveness in Sri Lanka. It is my pleasure to present to you the team who has worked on this endeavor for the last 9 months, myself, Tina, Maimuna, and Manisha. Next slide. For today's event, we will begin with the research question and purpose of the study, followed by a brief overview of the literature, methodology, findings, our recommendations for our client IRI and other civil society organizations, and the global best practice framework we created. Sri Lanka has had a long history of civil war, with its impact enduring today. We know that conflict gives rise to role changes in society. During the civil war in Sri Lanka, more women assumed once traditionally male-dominated roles, including heads of household and primary income earners. For women whose husbands were killed or are still missing in the war, these roles have been assumed indefinitely. Despite women taking on the double burden of child care provider and primary income earner, patriarchal beliefs on acceptable women's roles still prevent women from making significant gains in Sri Lanka. Once the war ended, women were expected to return to their sphere of domesticity. Even though their roles had changed, their status as inferior to men did not. And we have seen this play out in politics. Women's political representation remains exceedingly low in Sri Lanka. For example, in the national parliament, it has never exceeded 7% representation. Sri Lanka has a gender quota at the local level, which led to more women becoming interested in politics and wanting to run. But when they do run, they win at exceedingly low numbers, which begs the question, why? We set out in this research to understand the barriers preventing women from winning elections, and in so doing, understand the strategies that increase their competitiveness. Our recommendations are the strategies our client IRI and other civil society organizations can implement to promote women's political competitiveness.
Thanks, Corinne. So just to state again, our research question is, what strategies promote women's political competitiveness in post-conflict Sri Lanka? And we are conducting this research with the goal of creating a global best practice framework that best promotes women's political competitiveness. So early on in the research, the team knew that we'd be conducting interviews and focus group discussions, but to best inform what questions we wanted to ask in both, we had to do some desk research first. So to start off, we started with political competitiveness. And there were quite a few different definitions in the literature, but we decided to go with the definition that cited political competitiveness as the ability of an electoral competitor to overcome institutional and social barriers to win an election. And from that, we looked into what actually makes people competitive or what prevents them from being competitive. So we got a little into contestability literature. And we narrowed it down to the barriers or the reasons being rooted in structural and institutional barriers, and those took form in identity. So yes, gender, but in the Sri Lankan context, also ethnic identities, campaign finance, just having the ability to, or having the resources to run a successful campaign, and then political parties, these vast networks that almost make or break people's candidacy. So then in understanding what the main barriers were in terms of progress, we wanted to know how you can actually overcome those barriers. So we read up on a UN Global Best Practice Framework created by the World Federation of United Nations Associations, and it largely cited that there needed to be more funding, more support for political parties, more capacity building workshops, so mentorship, public speaking, those kinds of things, and quota systems. And those were, it would all take a very comprehensive approach, and all of those together would increase women's competitiveness. So we had quite a few moving parts, but they all helped inform our methodology, which Tina will elaborate on now.
Moving on to our research methods. So we decided to employ two kinds of qualitative data collection methods: focus group discussions and key informant interviews. We wanted to gain more clarity into what the current political scenario in Sri Lanka was, what were the stigmas attached to women entering the political sphere, which is very different from the traditional role of staying at home, and what were some of the exhausting challenges that they faced while navigating their way through some of the male-dominated spaces. So we wanted to hear these personal narratives and experiences from both the female and the male perspective. So we had 8 key informant interviews consisting of 7 female and 1 male participant. We also conducted 9 focus group discussions, all female groups, so that the participants felt comfortable sharing their experiences that they may otherwise feel unsafe to discuss in the presence of their male peers. All participants were selected from various districts of Sri Lanka, consisting of a mix of different ages, socioeconomic backgrounds, and ethnicities to mirror the population demographics. Participants included political party representatives, women's wing leaders, women candidates who had repeatedly failed to secure a seat, and also those female leaders who were successful in making it to the senior decision-making roles in the office. Given the travel restrictions, we hired a local research assistant to identify the study participants, facilitate the interviews and discussions, and to transcribe the primary data for us. All interviews were video recorded, transcribed, and translated to English by the research assistant before being sent to us. The data was then manually coded and categorized based on the themes that were identified as we sorted through those transcripts. Moving on to the next section to address those relevant themes and variances that developed during our analysis.
The findings. We categorized the barriers to women's political competitiveness into 3 solution groupings: societal, institutional, and individual. The barriers we grouped into the societal category require a societal solution, such as attitudes, social role expectations, and perceptions. The next category is institutions, and by this we mean both the physical organizations, such as political parties, but also informal institutions, such as values, norms, religion, ethnicity. Finally, the barriers grouped into the individual category are specific to each political candidate. These barriers will differ depending on the circumstances and experiences of the person and will impact female candidates to varying degrees. The barriers impacting women are often overlapping, as presented in the diagram. In the societal level, we saw social expectations for women, cyberbullying, and character misrepresentation. In the institutional level, we saw male domination of the political scene, lack of capacity building opportunities, media representation, political party support, effectiveness of the quota system. At the individual level, we saw a lack of familial support and lack of financial resources as all barriers. Out of the 8 key informant interviews and the 9 focus group discussions, we identified 9 major thematic findings which informed our recommendations. Finding 1, social role expectations for women are built into the fabric of society and are the #1 driving factor for keeping women out of politics. We expected the post-conflict dynamics to influence political competitiveness significantly, but we found that women rarely mentioned the war and instead focused on the cultural and social economic divides that have plagued Sri Lanka since its independence. The trends we see in Sri Lanka are in line with what we see around the world. Finding 2, cyberbullying and character misrepresentation deter potential candidates and intimidate existing candidates. Something surprising we found through our data analysis was that women were also directly involved in contributing to cyberbullying and character assassination. Because the political environment is so male-dominated, women feel the need to compete against one another for the limited spots available to them. Finding 3, male domination of the political arena allows little space for women to enter and make an impact. Finding 4, lack of capacity building opportunities leaves aspiring women candidates unable to compete against their peers. So women who desire to enter politics feel that they lack the necessary tools needed to be successful candidates, such as public speaking skills and political knowledge. Finding 5, media underrepresentation and critique hinders women's ability to run successful campaigns. Finding 6, the lack of political party support restricts the mobility and opportunities for potential political candidates. Participants shared that political candidates do not help female politicians establish and advance their careers, and specifically, political parties restrict women from earning nominations to contested positions. Finding 7, the implementation of the quota system has been effective in making space for women politicians, but it's still not enough. Finding 8, familial support is key for women political candidates because they provide funding, time, networks, and confidence to female candidates. And finally, finding 9, lack of financial resources makes women less politically competitive. Often, men use their financial resources to attract voters with material inducements. As one participant pointed out, everyone, even religious leaders, demand and expect some sort of compensation from the candidate as a way to earn their vote.
We use the thematic findings that we just presented to develop strategies that IRI or other civil society organizations can use to promote and improve women's political competitiveness in Sri Lanka specifically. We divided these recommendations into short-term interventions and long-term interventions. In the short term, we recommend that IRI and other civil society organizations implement the following strategies. First, work with media platforms to counter the online vitriol towards female political candidates and secure more opportunities for women to be interviewed and represented in mainstream media. Second, build a network of male allies in government, political parties, universities, and businesses who can spark conversations and inspire others to challenge the societal expectations of women. Next, work with families on a one-on-one basis to listen to their fears and concerns and develop strategies for how they can support their wives, sisters, or mothers who are running for office. This intervention in particular has the potential to be high impact because of the aforementioned critical nature of family support. Next, work to provide and secure funding for women's campaign activities. Outside of civil society organizations directly providing stipends for women's campaign activities, they can also help women secure funding from political parties or businesses. Compared to their male competitors, female political candidates are ambivalent towards accepting corporate sponsorships because they are worried about what they will be asked for in return. CSOs can guide female political candidates to set boundaries and expectations with potential corporate sponsors to alleviate their fears and ensure their safety. And then finally, on the topic of safety, CSOs and IRI can also provide security for women while they are campaigning. In the long term, we recommend the following interventions. First, develop a methodology to annually assess how political parties include women in legislative affairs and nomination lists. This assessment could take the form of an index which scores political parties on how gender inclusive they are. And using this assessment, IRI and other civil society organizations can develop party-specific interventions to improve women's participation in the political party itself, which will lead to women's increased political competitiveness. Next, IRI and civil society organizations can bridge relationships between political party leaders and female political candidates. They can also push for gender-inclusive journalism practices to become normalized and taught in universities. And finally, they can launch public awareness campaigns that aim to show demonstrative examples of women positively impacting Sri Lankan society, and this will help to change the societal perceptions of women and show that women can be a key member of society in Sri Lanka. Contrary to our original hypothesis, Sri Lanka is not unique when it comes to the political marginalization of women. The themes that came out of our focus group discussions mirror the themes that came up during our literature review and that we see in the rest of the world. Therefore, in general, the recommendations and interventions that we suggested to improve women's political competitiveness in Sri Lanka should be applicable in other countries. Based on this idea, we have developed a global best practice framework. Our proposed framework outlines the strategies that civil society organizations can use to improve women's political competitiveness in any country. The framework details the important components of an environment conducive to women's political competitiveness and the characteristics of strong female political candidates who will win elections. Organizations can use this framework to best match their capacity and resources with an intervention that will improve the environment or empower female candidates. For example, an organization that has an extensive existing community connections can focus on implementing strategies that require them to build on pre-existing relations in localities. This framework will also be productive in comparing women's political competitiveness across countries. We hope that this framework can be implemented to improve women's political competitiveness across the world. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and we are happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Team IRI, for that really interesting presentation. And so if there are questions, feel free to ask the questions. Use the Q&A button down on your screen to ask any questions of the IRI group. And so while we wait, I have just one question for the team IRI. And so all through this experience and giving the unprecedented environment in which you have carried out this research, what would you say have been the most, what you consider the most important lesson you've learned, and what has been most surprising for you? You can answer however you wish, in whatever order.
I think one of the things that has been really important for me to learn is the importance of constant communication to make sure everyone's on the same page. I think that especially in a virtual environment, it's really easy for people to have different expectations if they aren't communicated, and you have to communicate a lot more than you expect to make sure everyone's on the same page. So I think that's the lesson I'm taking away from the challenges we faced and the environment we were operating in.
I have a question.
Right. So Dr. Gardner asks.
Yes, I have a question about this very interesting suggestion you have on gender party assessments. I think this is actually extremely brilliant. And I'm wondering, first of all, how much you think this would be, first of all, who would be creating this assessment? How much do you think this would be accepted by the community? Because I think this could be really applicable all around the world. And my third part of that question is, does this exist anywhere else? Because this could be the beginning of sort of a global gender party assessment that parties then can do some deep thinking about. Even maybe the government would not fund fund parties, if there is that practice in each country, would not fund parties if they don't have a certain percentage of women in their parties. I think this is really quite brilliant.
I can take the first half, or I think the last half of that question. I know that the International Parliamentary Union does publish reports and findings every time an election happens, and they rank countries based on their gender representation. But in terms of the party level, I think really that is uncharted territory that we have not seen covered, but would still make an extremely large impact when you think about how much responsibility political parties have to speak up for women potential candidates and promote them, encourage them, and to be putting them on their list to even have the opportunity to run.
And I can tackle a little bit of the mechanics of it. I think as we were thinking about what this would look like, we were thinking that it would come mostly from civil society organizations developing a methodology similar to, let's say, the Freedom House methodology, where you're asking questions and asking political party members or using your own analysis to answer these questions and develop a score or a ranking system. And using that, I think, can help you compare different, and it can be done on an annual basis. So I think the onus comes from civil society organizations to kind of monitor this on a yearly basis. In terms of the acceptance of it, of course, the landing at first might be hard because no one wants to hear their flaws being pointed out, especially in such a public way. But I think that over time, this will be good because it gives an incentive, a reputational incentive to improve your situation so that you aren't consistently ranking low. And so I think fighting through those early maybe uncomfortableness, the early vulnerabilities associated with more public idea of like what's not working in your political party is inevitable, but also necessary in order for the long-term impacts to be seen.
Thank you. Really interesting.
Thank you. Ms. Shiban Pierce has a question. My apologies if I didn't pronounce that correct. Do you have recommendations for types of programming to work with families to provide support to women candidates? And Kim Hunter asks, because we don't have time, from your Sri Lankan specific research and the literature review, was there a comparative analysis of how the post-conflict setting of Sri Lanka impacts the research as opposed to non-conflict settings?
I can take the first question. Thank you, Ms. Pierce, for the question. So one of the recommendations that I would think is, so to definitely go in, from the perspective of having family-centric programs so that's very important to have. It's very important to have the entire family participate in such programs or such information sessions, so that they can understand how important it is that women candidates come forward, and how important it's to have women leaders in terms of making policy decisions regarding family. So one recommendation would be to, so one of, in today's world, one of the main thing is to influence them through like visual media, maybe like documentaries or like any kind of those kind of programs and stuff. So whatever, like all of those should be very family centric. That would be one of my recommendations.
And I think going off of what Tina said, also one of the things we discussed was almost kind of starting off early with younger women having programming to where like it's almost changing the narrative or changing the preconceived conception of like women actually being in politics. And then to address Kim's question as well. So we actually, one of the discussions that we were having early on was talking about Rwanda, because Rwanda is a great example of a post-conflict society. And I think they have the highest or maybe the second highest number of women in parliament in the world. But we were hoping to include it if more post-conflict dynamics were emphasized in the interviews and the focus group discussions. But when we saw that those themes weren't really being pulled out, we decided to leave it out of the final literature review. But that was, Rwanda specifically, was one of the countries that we were thinking about having a comparative study with.
And I would also just like to add, in terms of the first question, what Tina was talking about is very much like before women decide to run and convincing their families to support them in preparation. But I think there's also programs as women decide to run and gaining their family support after that decision has been made. And we envision that to be more of a one-to-one kind of mentoring, counseling type of program where families can get access to resources and get more information on what does it mean to run for office and and then I think also hearing their fears and then directly addressing those, or helping them, I say debunk, but I think a better word would be alleviate those fears. So what concerns do they have and how are they mitigated, or how can they help mitigate those concerns? Kind of giving families a plan to deal with some of the things they're concerned about as their family members go out into the campaign trail.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Team IRI. What spectacular way to end a whole year of hard work. And so because of time, I will just go ahead and cede the floor to Team BRAC. Team BRAC, you're on.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bo Chen Han, and we are the BRAC team. The title of our project is Understanding the Role of BRAC's Empowerment and Livelihoods for Adolescents program in women's employment and entrepreneurship in Tanzania and beyond. As many of you know, BRAC is an international development NGO, and we are basically assessing one of their women's socioeconomic programs in sub-Saharan Africa. I'll discuss our project's background, motivation, and research question before passing it on to my colleagues to discuss research design, key findings, and recommendations for our client, BRAC. So what is the Empowerment and Livelihoods for Adolescents program, otherwise known as ELA? The program's objective is to enable vulnerable and marginalized young women and girls to achieve their full potential. These young women and girls are placed in clubs of approximately 30, led by a mentor. The curriculum of the program has two components. First, the social programming component, which addresses topics such as self-awareness, social interaction, and bodily changes. And the second component is the economic programming, which focuses on financial agency and management, goal setting, and employable skills such as tailoring. And interweaving the curriculum are aspects like mentorship and peer socialization, which is aimed to help with the girls' receptiveness to the curriculum. The clubs overall serve as a complement to the public education system in many sub-Saharan Africa countries, providing training on soft skills that are generally not taught by public schools. Our research question is, has BRAC's ELA intervention contributed towards generating employment and entrepreneurship among the female participants, and if so, how? To break this down a little bit, the inputs of our question are the ELA program components that I just described, and the outputs are the factors that contribute to employment and entrepreneurship outcomes. And we determine what these factors are based on our literature review and also conversations with people on the ground. The how is where we discuss which program components mattered and which ones didn't, and why. And to be clear, we're not doing an impact assessment. We're not conducting a randomized controlled trial. So we can only point out correlations and speak to what is likely the case rather than what is definitively the case. And since this is our 2-year project that is still ongoing, we're focused more on assessing the building blocks for job finding and business starting rather than actual job finding or entrepreneurship rates. So what is our motivation for research? Why are we doing this now? The ELA program has existed since 2008 and has been assessed many times, but this is a new iteration of the program. There have been several updates made to ELA to address previously identified problems with the program, and these updates include curriculum revisions, age segmentation, which divides the girls into junior and senior groups, and improved mentor training. And we're also very interested in the change context of COVID-19 and the massive macroeconomic changes in Africa that have occurred in recent years. Our research site is 10 ELA clubs in the Dar es Salaam region in Tanzania. This program has been ongoing in Tanzania since 2019. And we hope our research for this limited population there can speak to larger trends in Tanzania and also other countries like Sierra Leone and Liberia, in which the same version of ELA is being carried out simultaneously. I will now pass it on to my colleague, Christina.
Thank you, Bo-Chen. I will now walk you through how we answered a research question that Bo-Chen discussed. First, we conducted a literature review, which revealed some important background information on barriers to women's employment in sub-Saharan Africa and in Tanzania specifically. In sub-Saharan Africa, we found that increasing urbanization leaves women behind in the agricultural sector, while patriarchal dominance, teen pregnancy, and lack of education and literacy efforts in post-conflict countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone were also major factors. In Tanzania specifically, we found that sexual and reproductive health, such as teen pregnancy, physical and sexual violence, and HIV/AIDS can negatively impact a woman's prospects for employment. Domestic responsibilities and gender role expectations in the household also leave women with no time to pursue employment. And lack of access to financial services, Tanzania's legal framework, and unequal access to education were also all barriers to women's economic empowerment and participation. Third, we researched existing policies on women's economic empowerment to help us understand what kind of policy environment that BRAC is working in. Here, it's worth noting the microfinance policy for women that works to provide fair, affordable services for women and youth. And the government also offers a vocational education and training system that offers basic technical skills and financial training for women and young girls to succeed in business endeavors. And this is something we found is also a possible path for some of the girls in the ELA program. To answer our research question, we conducted a non-experimental case study based on interviews with female participants and key informants. This was conducted remotely due to COVID and hired through local research assistants. First, the research assistants conducted interviews with 10 junior and 10 senior female participants from 10 BRAC youth clubs in Tanzania. They selected girls from across different clubs to increase the variability of the responses and focusing on those who spent more than a few months in the program. Later on, the research assistants also held 2 separate focus groups to help validate some of our findings and improve the quality and variability of our data. The goal of these particular interviews and focus group discussions was to see how, if at all, has participating in the program changed the girls' attitudes, perceptions, and skills relevant to economic empowerment, and which parts of the program did they find useful. Our second method was conducting key informant interviews with the BRAC staff, mentors, and some parents of the girl participants. And the goal of this was to understand how challenges in program implementation may have affected the girls' experience and to see what changes they have observed in the girls. And finally, we conducted key informant interviews with educators, women employers, and business owners, and local officials to determine how macro-level economic support structures and community-level barriers may have affected the girls' receptiveness to the program, and what would be helpful for the girls to learn in the future. With that said, I will now pass it on to Ali to share some of our key findings and analysis that we found from these interviews.
Thanks so much, Christina. So through this process that Christina has described, we determined 10 key findings. Here, I'll highlight 4 that are most pertinent to answering our research question. I'll also highlight a 5th finding that is key to the program itself. But before beginning, it's worth noting that the nature of our study may have resulted in a positive bias to our findings for 2 main reasons. First, the study was conducted by a BRAC team about a BRAC program. And second, we could only interview participants who were still in the ELA program. In other words, we couldn't interview those who had dropped out who might have a different perspective. Still, we found substantial evidence for our 5 key findings. First, we found that the ELA program may have contributed to increased positive attitudes towards education. This bodes well for the girls' economic empowerment because, as our research showed, Tanzania has a noticeable gender gap in the completion rates of secondary education. The education gap then exacerbates the employment gap and serves as a barrier to wage equality. Second, we found that the ELA program may have increased positive attitudes towards entrepreneurship. This is noteworthy because starting a business is an important way that Tanzanian women can earn an income, especially since they are less likely than men to complete higher education, which may be required for wage employment. These positive attitudes towards entrepreneurship are also directly tied to our 3rd key finding, which is that the ELA program increased participants' awareness of financial skills, such as budgeting, saving, and investing. It also taught them how to do these skills. And the skills are key to the girls' ability to become entrepreneurs since they have to manage their businesses' finances on their own. Financial skills also benefit girls who opt to participate in wage employment. Our 4th key finding is that participants expressed an increased awareness of the role that gender plays in local job markets. They often said that the ELA program had helped broaden their self-awareness, especially of the fact that they could transcend traditional gender norms. For example, as one senior participant shared, "I never knew that women could start a furniture business, but now I know that women can also be carpenters and own furniture businesses." More broadly, as a junior participant noted, women are as important as men, and women can do anything they want to. This increased confidence engaging with the community as women is a trait that local business owners look for when hiring. That means that ELA participants may be more likely to become employed and earn an income. Still, our research showed that there's some room for improvement in BRAC's programming. That brings me to our 5th and last key finding, which is that participant attendance at the clubs is sometimes inconsistent. For example, sometimes club activities coincide with the participants' schooling, especially for younger girls. That means that some participants cannot fully benefit from the ELA program. I'll now turn it over to Tori to share how BRAC can address this area for growth, as well as some other recommendations for future ELA programs.
Thanks, Ali. As we just highlighted in our key findings, BRAC's ELA curriculum addresses a soft skills niche that's not filled by the local schools in Tanzania, and that's been positively received by participants and the surrounding community, despite some of the biases that we named. To improve and expand the program, we have a few recommendations, prioritizing them based on the implementation timeline you can see here. So in the next 6 months, as the program is ongoing, we first recommend that BRAC interview those girls who've dropped from the club programming to determine why they did so and overcome some of the survivorship and sponsorship bias that was mentioned earlier. BRAC should also adjust the endline survey that they take at the end of the program to ask girls directly which modules they felt influenced them the most in the club. This will help tease out what parts of ELA were most useful to the girls, and gathering of that endline data should also include some female surveyors and interviewers, as gender differences taken from a male interviewer could change the way girls answer those questions and how much they share. In the medium term, say over the next couple years, BRAC should consider a few changes to the program itself, which promote women getting into the workplace more quickly and address barriers to engaging with the program. Some of those include shortening the program from 2 years to 1 year or less, so participants can begin working or their entrepreneurial activities more quickly. They should also consider school location and girls' placement so they can access the club easily just after their school and boost some of those attendance gaps, as well as updating club amenities so that girls feel more comfortable and they create a more conducive learning environment. For example, adding some fans during the hotter months in Tanzania. And though outside the scope of this study, we also suggest strengthening BRAC's boys programming to address some of the gender challenges that girls continue to face in their communities. Over the long term, there are some opportunities we found BRAC could embrace and make the program and their presence in Tanzania even stronger. And those recommendations were to find ways of partnering and possibly integrating the club curriculum into local schools, along with supporting participants' needs through food provision or microfinancing for their families, which allows more girls to attend the club rather than working, and also builds goodwill towards BRAC. We also recommend continuing to build a local network of women business owners who can both mentor and hire the girls who rise up through the Ella program. And we suggest doing a full impact assessment of the program itself, given the initial baseline was interrupted by the pandemic. And a more formalized assessment could allow BRAC to understand the program outcomes more fully. Finally, we learned a lot by doing this project remotely during a pandemic. So a few of our suggestions for BRAC and other similar NGOs who engage with remote research are listed at the bottom of this slide, primarily highlighting the importance of communication, regular updates from field teams, and regular review between research teams and RAs to ensure the consistency in data collection. To sum up, we'll leave you with some closing remarks. So overall, despite the noted positive bias, we found BRAC's program in Tanzania provides a great foundation of soft skills like self-awareness to girls and young women. These skills function as key building blocks for them to continue learning how to find jobs and start businesses. So seeing this correlation, we're really hopeful that the next generation of young women in Tanzania will be even further economically empowered through the Ella program's influence. And with that, we'll say a huge thank you for your time. We also want to express our gratitude toward the whole BRAC team, especially our incredible RAs who were our eyes and ears on the ground. And finally, thank you to SAIS Women Lead for the opportunity to engage in this practicum in such a unique year for research and learning.
Happy to kick off with a question. Fantastic. This was fantastic and really impressive. I think hopefully this is going to change the lives of a number of young women starting in Tanzania, but around the world. I should have noticed in the beginning, but are these Ella programs all over the world, or is this just in Tanzania? Because it seems that this would be the learnings of this continued out, of course, could be really important for women and girls as they either continue their education or pursue entrepreneurial professions. So first part of the question is BRAC involved around the world in these kinds of initiatives?
I can quickly answer that. So definitely, at the Ella program, or a different version of the Ella program, was actually started out in Asia. And in 2008, it moved to Sub-Saharan Africa. And concurrent with the program in Tanzania right now, there is a similar program in Sierra Leone and in Liberia. And previous programs have been done in other countries like South Sudan and Uganda.
I think it would be very interesting, you didn't have a chance to interview some of the BRAC graduates and see how many of them have become entrepreneurs and whether they then hire other BRAC young ladies to help them grow their business. That would be sort of the ideal. But fabulous job, really interesting.
So James has a question. Overall, what is the potential of this Ella model to promote empowerment for adolescents compared to other models?
I could go ahead and take that question. So I think comparison to other similar models from other NGOs was outside this scope of research, but what we can say one of the strengths of the Ella program is the great soft skills components and self-awareness features in it. And we saw a very strong correlation in those skills and the empowerment through self-awareness that the girls and young women were taking with them into learning further skills that fostered economic empowerment.
I can add on to that a little bit. So as Tori said, I think this is outside the scope of our research, but I do think the results of our project show that a combined model with both social and economic programming is very helpful. I think previous research has shown that standalone economic empowerment programs and standalone social empowerment programs aren't as effective, but when you put it all together as a bundle, it could be very effective. And we see how soft skills, as Tori was mentioning, like self-awareness, can help girls become more economically empowered.
And so just, I don't know if you can speak a little bit to, because I don't think I heard this came through in your presentation. While you were conducting this research, the then president of Tanzania died, Magufuli died. Was there did that impact the study in any way? And was there also any impact of the COVID-19 crisis on your research outside of the constraints to travel?
I can take that. I can start with the COVID aspect. It certainly affected our ability to travel, of course, because we could not. And so we had these fantastic research assistants on the ground in Tanzania to actually conduct the interviews for us. In terms of it affecting the completion of the interviews itself, and including the focus group discussions, the COVID was mostly a factor in terms of the data that we were able to collect for the past year in order to corroborate our own qualitative research. So the clubs shut down for 3 months last year, which affected the length of time that our interviewees had been in the program. In terms of the president's unfortunate passing, it happened right in the middle of our research. And so it certainly could have been a factor because we weren't on the ground. It was hard to tell. But from communicating with our research assistants, it didn't seem to have much of an impact on the research process or the findings of our data collection.
If we have other questions, we'll briefly take those before we move on to the next team.
Can I just make a comment? I actually really appreciated, it was Ali, I think, who really enunciated the challenges and the weaknesses of the research, in that you couldn't interview those who had dropped out. And I think that would have been, that would be very interesting in a subsequent study, just to find out why it is. You know, was it boring, or did they have too much housework to do at home, or was the program, you know, in the wrong location, or they were bullied? That would be quite interesting to find that cohort, or at least for BRAC to find that cohort and interview them. On the other hand, they might not want to share with BRAC, so it might have to be a third party, and a woman, as you rightly pointed out.
In the absence of further questions, thank you so very much, Team BRAC. This has been a labor of very challenging, but you definitely rose to the occasion. And I am sure that BRAC appreciates all the work you've done. And also, we appreciate BRAC's support and partnership in return. And so we will move on at this point to the next team that will be presenting, which will be Team WIIS. And just so that I keep a consistency, I will quite simply cede the floor to Team WIIS. Team WIIS, you're on.
Hello and welcome. We're here today to convey this one important message. Women farm workers in U.S. agricultural sector are essential contributors to domestic food security, yet face more barriers to safe work environments and social services simply because they are women. Today, our team will present in partnership with Women in International Security our findings on food security in crisis, assessing the social challenges of women farm workers in agricultural America. Women farm workers are essential parts of our food supply chain and integral to U.S. food security. As we can see here, there has been an increase in women farm workers in the U.S., and currently 31% of workers in the agricultural sector are women. However, even though women contribute to a significant share of agricultural production, their efforts and needs are not visible on the men-dominated farms. Therefore, the gender analysis of this study aims to show the role that women farm workers play in food security and recommend policies to properly serve women farm workers. It is important to note that aside from gender, immigration status is an important aspect shaping the experience of these essential farm workers. The findings of our study primarily reflect on the situation of H-2A visa holders and undocumented farm workers. H-2A visa grants immigrants the idea of being tied to one or two U.S. employers for a set period of time. With this visa, essential workers retain the right to minimum wage. However, they're excluded from benefits granted by the Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protection Act and programs such as Social Security. And without further ado, we're going to get into the details of our project.
The team utilized a mixed methods approach for this research project. While our qualitative data provides an in-depth understanding of the California farm worker experience, we complemented it with quantitative data to capture the breadth of farm worker experiences across America. The 21 farm workers we remotely interviewed uniformly revealed the hardships on the field and at home. Our 10 key informant interviews affirmed these observations, with one expert noting that having rights is not sufficient. They must be known and enforced to make a difference, which is a crucial policy angle that plays out in our research. We further hypothesized that the woman farm worker's double burden of responsibilities limits her well-being and reduces her productivity. Through our regression, we found that gender and parenting status are significant variables that reduce a woman's ability to work regardless of her crop or her state. Finally, to supplement our qualitative findings for COVID-19, we obtained vaccination data through a survey. Based on this mixed methods approach, we have gathered and organized our findings across themes. To start us off, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration does have requirements for worker housing. However, the lack of OSHA inspections and failure to enforce these regulations frequently allows overcrowding and health hazards to occur. There is also a shortage of housing in general due to the lack of public subsidies and lobbying forces that prevent the construction of new affordable housing. Even though H-2A workers are guaranteed housing, employers tend to place them in congested groups of 4 to 6 per apartment. Crowding limits the access to cleaning facilities, which are crucial to farm workers exposed to pesticides. In the context of COVID-19, it also means that social distancing is impossible. Transportation is similarly characterized with physical crowding for families, but also isolation for women. Women often need transportation to take their child to school and may rely on a supervisor to drive them. The supervisor, often a man, can take advantage of the isolation that a vehicle provides. As such, housing conditions and transportation often creates health hazards for farm workers and puts women in positions that are vulnerable to exploitation.
Now, as previously mentioned by Chazelle, an important finding for our research was that although women do not currently make up a majority of the labor force, the increase in numbers means that we will need to start paying more attention to them if we hope to secure links in the food supply chain. With that in mind, this quote from a farm organizer best highlights the research from our study regarding women farm workers. Women farm workers are typically concentrated in less physically demanding tasks. However, that does not mean they take on less of the responsibility, and that is often unrecognized. Again, women farm workers bear the double burden of household and childcare responsibilities on top of their duties at work. Our studies found that the absence of childcare facilities makes this an especially challenging effort. Most women either rely on informal childcare structures, such as extended family and friends, or on women leaders in the community who specialize in providing childcare. This instance in particular has created another subset of women that are not being recognized within the agricultural sector, even though they are necessary for the labor force to function properly. In terms of the pandemic, children are spending more time at home and using up more resources, which has placed women in more difficult conditions. For a woman farm worker interviewed in our study, this meant that her family did not have enough food to last them throughout the week. For others, this meant that work productivity decreased because they were not able to afford or find childcare services for the hours that their children were not in school. Now, when we discuss labor conditions on farms, our study found that the increased production of labor-intensive crops such as sweet corn and tomatoes has had a large impact on both the physical and mental health of farm workers and their families. This has translated into longer hours and exhaustion for workers. And for women, this is an enduring challenge when they leave the field and must go home. One farm worker mentioned that at times she would forget that she had a husband. And for another, she described how the longer hours kept her from watching her 3-year-old daughter grow up. Keep in mind, these are all sacrifices that women farm workers must make in order to keep up with productivity. What makes this worse, however, is that even though there are high rates of sickness and injury, as well as clear mental health deterioration for farm workers, employers are not provided with health insurance to give to their employees. Most farm workers are also ineligible for Medicaid within their state. So by that same token, hardship does not translate to better or fair pay. Analysis of the NAS data shows that the average hourly wage for women was more than $1 less than the men between 2016 and 2018. Overtime is also not provided to farm workers due to current labor laws, so all farm workers must work double time just to meet that minimum wage.
We also found that women farm workers are vulnerable because of the power structure on the farm. Generally, individual farm workers are the most powerless. They're organized into crews and are supervised by crew leaders, which we call mayordomos or mayordomas for women in Spanish. Labor contractors communicate between mayordomos and farm owners who have the ultimate control over decisions on the farms. Because most male farm workers have been in the US longer than the women, they dominate the supervisory roles, the better paid positions, and more of them have legal status because of previous immigration reforms. These enable men with power, especially the mayordomos, to exploit and abuse women farm workers and exclude women from promotions. And because more women are undocumented and are concerned about deportation, they're not likely to report abuses. This quote from Dr. Lynn Steffen, who's a scholar in migrant farm workers and women's studies at the University of Oregon, tells us how women are multiply vulnerable in the community. 2 reasons why women farm workers are suffering from the adverse labor conditions are: first, federal laws do not protect agricultural workers. Farm workers are still excluded from parts of major labor rights protection laws, such as the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. farm workers are not covered by overtime payment or protection of the rights to bargain collectively. Smaller farms are not even required to pay minimum wage. And the second is the lack of regulatory oversight and implementation of guidelines by OSHA. OSHA is understaffed and lack of funding to inspect farms as often as they're expected to. OSHA staff also lacks discretion when investigating on farms. They lack the cultural understanding of the most vulnerable communities, such as the indigenous farm workers who might not speak English or Spanish, and undocumented farm workers who are afraid to reach out to OSHA. This quote is from a farm worker interviewee who noted that OSHA does not provide safe environments for them to report abuses.
We knew prior to our study that women in the agricultural sector experience very high rates of workplace gender-based violence, which includes harassment, sexual assault, and rape. Our study contributes the existing knowledge base by identifying the specific workplace dynamics that facilitate the exploitation of women farm workers, particularly the role of foremen, or mayordomos, in perpetuating gender-based violence within the agricultural hierarchy. There are many barriers for women farm workers to report workplace gender-based violence, ranging from retribution, which includes termination of employment, to threats of deportation. Perpetrators of violence manipulate survivors using their positions of authority within the sector into remaining silent. Finally, the topic of gender-based violence cannot be discussed without addressing intimate partner violence, also known as domestic violence. Women in the agricultural sector experience very high rates of intimate partner violence at home. Since workplace gender-based violence does not happen in a vacuum, it is influenced and normalized by the prevalence of violence against women within farm worker communities. In some cases, farm worker women will not report violence for fear of losing their jobs, their husbands' jobs, retribution, and deportation. In conclusion, women farm workers are essential to the U.S. food supply system and food security, yet face barriers to safe workplaces, housing, transportation, and healthcare. Further, women farm workers face discrimination within the agricultural sector, including widespread gender-based violence, which is augmented by the agricultural hierarchy. Finally, while women farm workers have served as essential workers during the pandemic, they have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. Sadly, while these women are risking their lives to feed our families, they themselves are facing widespread food insecurity and a nutrition crisis among their children.
Governments and policies have lumped the issues of men and women farm workers as if their experiences were the same. This has led to policies and protection practices that have not been efficient or inclusive, harming the production potential of women and thus that of the agricultural sector. Today, we're highlighting these 4 policy goals to better serve women farm workers. First, in terms of advancing gender equity, the federal government should increase the number of H-2A visas available for women in order to facilitate their access to legal status and decrease their dependency on other individuals, which often results in exploitation. Second, in order to strengthen basic public services, monetary stimulus packages should go to local organizations currently filling gaps in services like childcare, housing, and providing food and potable water for the population. This is especially important during a crisis where women farm workers have been struggling the most to provide safe conditions to their families. Third, expanding legal protections through the FLSA Act to include all H-2A farm workers would reduce agricultural exceptionalism and provide women with minimum wage, mandatory overtime, insurance, and the right to unionize. Fourth, improving oversight and accountability is essential. Therefore, the government should expand OSHA's mandate to cover gender-based violence, sexual harassment, pesticide use, and on-site sanitation facilities. which are currently hurting women farm workers the most. Nonetheless, appropriate funding is essential to make any of these changes take place. And thus, these are some of the recommendations we wanted to highlight for you today based on the timeliness and feasibility of them. The most important takeaway is that in order to move forward with any policy, women must be accounted for and they must also be understood. Otherwise, the policies will simply fall short as they have historically. Thank you for the time to listen to our presentation and giving us this space. We will answer any questions at this point.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for another exciting presentation and just the wonderful work you have done here. We will take the first question from, or before that, Professor Gardner, do you have questions before we go to the Q&A chat?
I always have questions. I just this was a fantastic presentation, and every time I hear these statistics, I get very upset, because basically you have told us that the people who are picking our fruit and vegetables, who have made COVID relatively comfortable for some of us, means that the workers themselves were not eligible for Medicaid or any services or protections, lacked any kind of legal protection, including minimum wage, had lack of any oversight as to the conditions in which they were living and working. And then you add on all the gender-based violence part, which is horrific. And so my question to you is, if you were to have a sit down with the Biden administration top ag people and top members in the Department of Labor and OSHA, what would be the three main asks that you would have to help these people?
Absolutely, Dr. Gardner. Thank you so much for your question. And we really hope we have that time to sit down with the administration and have this conversation. From our team, our perspective is that the #1 priority for the Biden administration and any kind of policy for farm workers would be to gender the idea of immigration, gender the idea of looking at essential workers. That is why our first recommendation is advancing gender equity. And in order to do that, we must first know what women are doing and what they're a part of, and also understand how they contribute to this. Accountability is enabled by the idea of having this data, by having this information. So we do believe that this is the easiest and the most timely recommendation at this point. Our second would be expanding legal protections. And the reason why this one is not first is because we have seen a historical restraint to making this happen. And therefore, we want to make sure that the data is there so that when accountability happens, when expansion of legal protections occurs, it is backed by science, it is backed by data, it is backed by facts. And the emotion will come through, as you have seen through our presentation. So expanding legal protections would be #2, and then improving oversight and accountability would be #3.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Chantal has a question. You mentioned, congratulations on the research. You mentioned the number of women farm workers is increasing. Do you have an idea as to why this is the case? And what is their status? Are they undocumented, or do they come in with visa?
Right, so I can take that question, which is a great question to ask. Unfortunately, there's not really a way to pinpoint the exact reason why the number of women farm workers are increasing. It's a bit of a mixed reasoning. Much of it has to do with increased migration numbers, especially from the Northern Triangle. Other reasons has to deal more with the agriculture sector in general, especially with the modernization of technology and the way in which crops are produced. This allows women to enter into tasks that are less physically demanding, as we mentioned previously. And in terms of the type of women who are coming in, the type of immigration status that they have, we are seeing an overall increase through the NAS data of all sectors. So that includes citizens, unauthorized, also H-2A workers or other visa statuses. However, the one that is the most is going to be undocumented. So we're going to see a significant rise in undocumented farm workers in comparison to the other groups.
Thank you. And so again, one of the questions that interest me, or that I really want to hear from students across the teams, and as well as the team generally, is what would you consider the most important skill or most important lesson you've learned through this research at this particular point in time, and what has been most surprising to you?
I'd be happy to answer this question. I think the opportunity to conduct a research study virtually has certainly been a strong skill that we've taken away from this opportunity. Being able to coordinate with local fixers on the ground was really remarkable, and speaks to both the ability of technology to create these pathways, but also the fortitude, flexibility, and just immense strength of organizers on the ground. And we really want to recognize the role of these activists in both serving the communities, these underserved communities, but also in cooperating with research teams like us who are trying to bring greater attention to underserved and marginalized communities. That would be my answer to that question.
I think I can go next in terms of in findings, what was most significant for us, and kind of answering Chantel's question as well in the Q&A box. I think the most important finding for me, as well as most surprising, was the idea of childcare facilities and how there is a lack of them, and how that really impacts the productivity and the work of women farm workers in comparison to the men. And again, kind of highlighting one of the most significant parts was the informal structures that are within the community of the labor force, especially with women leaders who take on childcare responsibilities, even though they're not technically in the labor force themselves. Again, this highlights that subset group of women, another group we can see that is underrepresented and unrecognized, and that's not something that's necessarily talked about within policy.
We have a couple more minutes for a couple more questions, if we have those.
Well, I have a question. What surprised you from the research? Was there, because we all can expect that the situation's pretty bad for these farm workers, but was there anything that really jumped out at you when you were doing the interviews that shocked you particularly?
Thank you for asking that question, Dr. Gardner. I can take that. And I think something that really struck all of us throughout this research process was that the lack of accountability, the lack of enforcement, the lack of implementation of existing regulations that also come alongside of the lack of regulations in general that are needed to protect these farm workers. So in understanding OSHA and learning of how OSHA operates, we see their lack of inspections. For instance, among grazing growers in Fresno County, in the 5-year period, only 3% of their housing was inspected. This is a very low rate. OSHA is clearly lacking in inspections. On the other hand, they also lack the funding and resources to have the staff, to have the competent staff in order to conduct these inspections and understand what's happening on the ground. So there's this lack of implementation problem, but at the same time, also missing purveyance of OSHA. They do not have a mandate for gender-based violence. They do not offer recourse for women who are experiencing really unique and disproportionate amounts of challenges as farm workers. So I think this was something that really struck us, and really, it was really powerful to hear how lacking it is, how lacking OSHA is. One of our quotes from an expert was also that unless, as Sheer mentioned too, when OSHA doesn't show up unless there's a death. And we think that we think justice is not responding to a death, but to prevent it and to implement the resources to allow proper protections that prevent us from getting to such a dire situation.
Can I make a follow-up question on this, Professor Nwankwor?
Right. Yes, right after you. Go ahead.
Yeah, just so if you're still sitting with the Biden administration team, and they're saying, okay, is the answer to give more money to OSHA and different departments in the Department of Labor for greater oversight, or should there be a certain amount given to the grassroots communities to help strengthen them? Because it seems like there are, you've met some of them, and some of these communities are really doing quite a bit to basically put a Band-Aid on the situation, which is deplorable. So would you recommend some money going to these local communities as well?
Yes, I can take this question. We definitely would recommend that the federal or the state allocate more funding to local grassroots organizations, because we think that they are the people who know what farm workers need the most, and they are the people that the farm workers trust the most and can utilize their service. And we know that the grassroots organizations provide all-encompassing service, including healthcare and counseling service for sexual harassment victims, and also they provide like even simple activities like Zumba classes to farm workers who, like the women farmers, say that they would really want it and really need it for their lives. We also want to mention one best practice from a Florida local organization called the Coalition of Immokalee Farm Workers. They really, maybe Isadora can add on to this.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to discuss the work of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which was actually founded by 2 SAIS alumni, which demonstrates the feats and contributions that SAIS can make to society. Coalition of Immokalee Workers was founded in Immokalee, Florida, approximately 2 decades ago. Immokalee, Florida was previously the epicenter of forced labor within the United States, with immense human rights abuses, including, as I mentioned, forced labor, rampant rape in the fields, etc. And what the Coalition of Immokalee Workers has done is leverage the market power to achieve human rights equality within these farm workers. So what this coalition has really remarkably done is worked with both producers, farm growers, and consumers, big name consumers such as Subway or Walmart. And what they've done really remarkably is use this market power to ensure that farm growers are respecting human rights. And this includes signing a convention on human rights, as well as agreeing to regular oversight and inspections led by CIW, regular education sessions, and also work on gender-based violence resolution. And what this coalition has resulted in is an immense decrease in human rights violations and forced labor in what used to be really the epicenter of human rights abuses. So when we're looking at best practices, I highly recommend the Coalition of Immokalee Workers for demonstrating the ability to harvest the economic power to achieve human rights equality.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for yet another powerful presentation. And we're going to quickly take the last question from Chantal, and then we'll move on. She asks, what about farm owners? Have they ever been prosecuted? Have farm owners ever been prosecuted in these kinds of, committing these kinds of atrocities and crimes?
Sure, I can answer this one as well. Absolutely, they have. We've seen federal lawsuits, particularly going back to Immokalee. We've seen federal lawsuits brought by the United States government against farm owners responsible for really truly egregious human rights abuses. However, this is not the norm. Immokalee has gained a lot of national attention. However, these human rights abuses are still pervasive across the larger United States. So while some farm owners have been prosecuted and held accountable, the vast majority are able to act essentially with impunity. So there is a significant need for better oversight, which is why we're speaking about OSHA and improving both funding, but also reallocating funding to grassroots organizations that have already created these networks and community trust in order to reach marginalized communities that perhaps are more resistant, particularly undocumented individuals, towards reporting to federal individuals. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And so we'll be moving on to Dr. Gardner, who will be providing some brief reflections. Professor Nina Gardner is an adjunct lecturer at Johns Hopkins SAIS and is the director of Strategy International, a consulting firm she founded that specializes in corporate social responsibility, sustainability, and climate change. Prior to her work in CSR, she practiced law in Washington, D.C. and in Prague. She then joined the UN as a political officer in the Zagreb Liaison Office, post-Operation Flash and Storm in 1996, and then with the OSCE focusing on institution building in Vukovar. Professor Gardner is an activist in women's issues. She is the founding president of 3 professional women's associations in Europe and was instrumental in getting the OECD Women's Entrepreneurship MENA program launched. She's on the advisory board of the Women's Forum for the Economy in Society and the Harvard Coalition for Responsible Investment. Dr. Gardner.
Thank you very much. Well, what an accomplishment, ladies. Having been with Dr. Nwankwor from the very beginning, when we first met in September, you all have come a long way. And these were 3 extraordinary presentations and on very thorny, difficult subjects. And you have clearly shown us how much you've learned in the last few months during these practica. And some of the key learnings, I think, is for, first of all, how to work with a client in the real world, manage expectations, and create a relationship with your client, which I hope will continue. You have learned to conduct interviews. For some of you, halfway across the world, I have to say, very impressive for those working with Sri Lanka and Tanzania, but even California, different time zones, all of that you learned to deal with, and you managed somehow. You never had the benefit of being able to assess a situation in the trenches or meet your interviewees in person. So, you know, I have to say, hats off to you, because I have never been able to do this. And I think many of us in the field of research have never really dealt with all the virtual Zoom issues. So you are sort of the first. You are the Sputniks of our generation. You've also learned to redirect when the pandemic created what seemed like insurmountable obstacles. Not only the technology, and some of you have had, you know, chickens and dogs barking in the middle of interviews, and if you even got internet, which was a problem not only for us, but can you imagine in many of these countries or in rural communities. And also managed to redirect when the people and groups you were counting on didn't pan out and you had to find others. That is part of the research process. And you managed to do that. I've watched your increase in confidence in the way you conduct your interviews and your presentations and your writing, and that has been really exciting and heartwarming. And most of all, you've learned to work with some amazing women on your team and on the ground. And I really hope that one day, I don't know whether you've even met your teammates in person. I'm hoping that some of you have, but maybe some of you have not. And I also hope you have a chance to meet one day some of the people on the ground that you interviewed. These are friendships and that I hope you will cherish for life. You've really managed against all odds, and I have to say this must be the class that has come up with against the greatest number of challenges. You've met them, and you know, you were the guinea pigs of how much can be done virtually. A few points I wanted to leave you with. Notwithstanding this year, I do want to underscore that armchair research is not the way to go, ideally. Okay. I want to urge you to travel out of your comfort zone throughout your life, starting with, graduation, and hopefully you're vaccinated. Meet the people out of your usual circle. And the fact that you signed up for this practicum means you already know that, but I really hope that this does not make you complacent about future information gathering, whatever professions you go into. You miss so much by not being in the trenches with your subjects. It's just irreplaceable. Second, be aware of the riches your interviews have bestowed upon you. There's growing academic discussion regarding the ethics of what we call extractive research or extractive journalism. You have to be aware and do your part. Your interviewers have contributed a great deal to your research, and without them, you would not have been able to prepare these reports. So many of these people, many of them in a very much more vulnerable position than you, and many of them women, had the courage to confide in you and shared very, very difficult stories with you from the impersonal lens of Zoom land, without even the benefit of being able to look at you directly in the eye or have a handshake or a coffee. Yet they trusted you, okay? They trusted you. So my message is, find a way to give back. They've confided in you their hopes and fears. You're giving them a voice. You're giving them to either policymakers, as in the Ag Practicum for WIIS, or clients who I hope are going to take away some of these excellent suggestions that the IRI and BRAC teams made to their clients, and help improve your skills in order to give greater opportunities, right? So you are going to hopefully really take your learnings and be their ambassadors. Be their ambassadors in your professional life. Be their ambassadors even personally. I hope one day you will be able to meet these people wherever they are, whether they are in California, or whether they are in Tanzania or in Sri Lanka. But this was a very special opportunity you had to work with amazing women on your team and hear amazing stories. I was blessed to hear a few of the interviews, and I was thankfully not having to conduct the interviews because I was in tears, as many of these farm workers basically turned to the camera and said, "Thank you for listening to us, for caring about us." So this is something I think was so touching, and I hope that you will remember that always and help them have a voice. So thank you for that, and congratulations to this incredible group of women who have really overcome all odds to do extraordinary research. Bravo.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Professor Gardner. And thank you to everyone that has joined to participate in this presentation today. A special thank you to our clients, IRI, BRAC, and WIIS, for their partnership and support this past year. The students are also grateful to their families and friends and who have unwaveringly supported them throughout this journey. A special thank you to Giselle Povidano, who has been the SAIS Women Lead RA this past year. A million thanks to you, Giselle, you rock. A special kudos to the teams and individual students who have done such amazing work. I have watched you grow throughout this period. I have watched you rise to the occasion. I have watched you navigate changes from the client, changes in the project, and you have done this spectacularly well. I have watched you navigate, teamwork and all of its dynamics. And, I am so very proud of you all. We wish you the best as you transition to your next endeavor. Applications, just to note, applications for the Practicum project for the next academic year is currently open. So we invite you to apply if you're first year or you're interested. We also invite you to engage with SAIS Women Lead in the coming year as we continue with our research and programming agenda. Again, thank you everyone so very much for joining us and supporting us this past year. It's been really great. Thank you.